Good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to welcome you all this evening. Our special program, a TETE with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. This was organized at a short notice, but so nice to see all packed with the full audience. On behalf of the AMA and the audience, I extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Shashi Tharoor, to whom and we're very fortunate that he was in AMA 2 times before this event. And I am indeed privileged to introduce our distinguished speaker, who doesn't actually need an introduction, but I'll be very brief for the benefit of the audience and especially the youngsters. As you are aware, Dr. Tharoor is a multifaceted personality, a diplomat, an educator, a civil servant, a politician, an author, a public intellectual, and of course, a great orator. He was the former Undersecretary General of the United Nations, an organization which he served for 23 years. He is a He's representing the third consecutive time Thiruvananthapuram as the member of parliament from that place. And formerly also he was a Minister of State for External Affairs and also the Minister of Human Resources Development in the Government of India. And he also chaired various parliamentary committees. He has won several awards, some of which include the Pravasiya Bharatiya Sanman and the Sahitya Academy Award in the category of English non-fiction. Dr. Tharoor is a best-selling author of 23 books. So, when we, in management parlance, when we talk of multitasking, he's a guy who's handling so many things at the same time, could write 23 books. So commendable. And most of them bestsellers. And I remember that we were so happy to have you, sir, in 2017 when you were here for the Ahmedabad release of a famous book, An Era of Darkness. Today's session will be moderated by Mr. Dr. A.P. Ashwin Kumar, who is the director of the Amrit Modi School of Management at the Ahmedabad University. And I request my friend and the honorary treasurer, Mr. Rajaram, to welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor with a bouquet. Rajaram, please also welcome Mr. Ashwin Kumar, please. Yeah, since you are here. I express my gratitude to Mr. Jainil Shah for arranging this event, and I request Jainil to come up to coordinate rest of the proceeding. Jainil, thank you.
Thank you so much, Divyesh. I was just a little afraid when you took the stage because I was afraid you would say that Dr. Shashi Tharoor is fluent in 4 languages, Malayalam, Hindi, and one more. But I think, let me tell you, in English is more than fluent. So I'm glad you've missed that part of introduction. Yeah. So I have 3 minutes. I have 3 jobs to do. I'll rather be very fast. But at the outset, sir, thank you so much for accepting this invitation. I still remember I was at his office in March early this year, and I said that I want you to come at the Ahmedabad Management Association. He readily agreed then. But it's only then that it took about 6 months for his script to materialize. In fact, this event was also supposed to happen on Saturday evening, but thanks to his political compulsions, he had to prepone it. But before he preponed, I think there's a lesson in commitment for all the youngsters sitting out there, especially students, that before he preponed his schedule, he checked with me whether Ahmedabad Management Association will be equally comfortable or not. Only after we said yes, sir, did he go ahead and prepone the trip. I think that shows his commitment. Uh, so I have this job of introducing Dr. Tharoor as an author to you briefly in about 30 seconds. It's a difficult job, but when we were sending out invitations, sir, we said that you've spent about now half a century as an author, and a lot of people were not willing to believe that. Not because you look young, but they possibly felt that there was some error in counting the number of years that you've been writing for. But the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, he started writing when he was 6, and he, hold your applauses, he got published before his 11th birthday. And one of the records that is still at his name in the Fletcher School is being one of the youngest recipients of doctorate at the age of 22, which is one of the most prestigious school of public policy. There are a handful of people right now in this world who have achieved doctorate at the age of 22. But more than that, he's published more than 5 million words. That's about 5 crore words. I think on an average, a doctoral thesis in India takes about a lakh of words. So that's 500 times one doctoral thesis by Dr. Tharoor. 24 books to his credit. Yes, the latest being that of a biography of Dr. Ambedkar. But more than that, in 1989, he published a book called The Great Indian Novel, which has been reprinted 43 times. And I believe it was year 2000, sir, correct me if not wrong, when Bill Clinton was addressing the Indian Parliament. And even he went on to cite one of his books, which was India from Midnight to Millennium. So, yes, he's a very accomplished author. Yes, needless to say, he has a Sahitya Academy Award to his credit as well. And so, ladies and gentlemen, make no mistake when I say that he's one of the greatest authors of our times. A loud round of applause for Dr. Tharoor. Also joining him on the stage is Professor Dr. Ashwin Kumar. Dr. Ashwin is currently the Director for Center for Learning Futures at Ahmedabad University. He has over a decade of experience in teaching and research and is a prolific writer himself. He has worked in higher education, grant design, and policy review alongside being a literary and academic translator. His research interests are primarily in philosophy of culture, cultural theory, and conceptual history. His work addresses questions related to philosophical landscape of the issues involved in human cultures. Prior to joining Ahmedabad University, Dr. Ashwin was associated with Sir Ratan Tata Trust and also with Center for Study of Culture Studies at Bangalore as the head of Regional Language Resources Initiative. All right, so I'm not going to stand anywhere between you and Dr. Tharoor. Wishing you all a scintillating evening. So, over to you.
I hope I'm audible. Yeah. I had a difficult task preparing for the interview of Dr. Tharoor because I was going through YouTube video after YouTube video of Dr. Tharoor's interviews. And I was wondering, here is a man who really is thinking on his feet. He's such an agile thinker. We need to get him to share with us new things, which he has not already shared with other people. And that's a thing for the agenda. Probably I should begin by a disclaimer for the audience. This is not primetime television. So like with all Indian philosophers who begin by saying what they're not doing, we should probably list out the things we're not doing in this interview. We're not going to quiz him about his English skills. We're not going to throw a piece of controversial news at him and ask him.
No breaking news tonight. Good.
Yeah, and throwing a piece of controversial news and asking him for his opinions. The idea of this conversation, Dr. Tharoor, is to really draw you out on the rich experience that you've had and to ask you to reflect on each one of those aspects of your life. So I thought we'll begin the questions with something closer home. Um, for many of us here, and particularly me, uh, the idea of a liberal education is something very dear and close to our hearts. And probably you're the best product of a liberal education one can imagine. Uh, we know probably by reading your own autobiographical writings and some of your interviews about what are the elements that went into the making of Shashi Tharoor. But can you also help us reflect on what are the elements that go into the making of people like Shashi Tharoor? What are these things that we can abstract from your specific experience to say, how does one build uh, a person of this variety? Because remember, I'm asking you this from really multiple positions. I'm asking this as a young parent. I'm asking this on behalf of probably many institution builders who are here. This is a challenge for us.
It's a tough one to answer, but it demands, as you say, a certain level of introspection that one is not often called upon to indulge in by television anchors and the like. But I will say that for me, I think perhaps the defining experience of my childhood was probably that I was a sufferer from a rather bad case of asthma. It was something which, I was born in London. My parents happened to be living and working there at the time. Moved to India when I was 2.5, and almost immediately started developing some rather severe bronchial asthma. No one quite knew why in those days. In any case, treatment was much more primitive than today. There were no inhalers and so on, and bronchodilators and so on. So what you had to do was take some rather strong pills that made your heart go thud thud thud, and somehow force your lungs open to be able to breathe a bit. Uh, and the result was that from a very young age I was learning to do everything while struggling for air, which is kind of a character forming experience, I can tell you, because very often even nights would be spent propped up in bed on pillows, because if I lay down I couldn't breathe, and somehow trying to get through the night without being, and so it was tough. I mean, I'll say that I was taking examinations while struggling to breathe. I was when I was well enough, I would enjoy playing cricket and so on. I always say that when I was young, I used to really want to play cricket very badly, and that's exactly what I did when I grew up. I played cricket very badly. So as part of the reason was that because my health meant that very frequently I was behind my peers in terms of growth and so on. So as a young kid, that became a defining thing. So now, in some ways, I think it helped because it sort of forced me to learn to concentrate. Because you really have to, things that other people were taking for granted as something as obvious as breathing became an issue. You had to make a serious effort to sit down and do whatever it was you wanted to do. Now, for me, remember, I was growing up in India without television. Nintendo and PlayStation weren't a gleam in inventors' eye. Nobody had computers or mobile phones or laptops or whatever. So what did I have when I was ill? Not well enough to sleep and not well enough to play or do anything else. I would basically sit in bed and read. So books became my escape, my entertainment, and at the same time, or my education, my instruction. And so the result was that I read widely and indiscriminately. And I think that again had a tremendous formative effect on who I was. I became very fond of words. I was the oldest child in the family. So whenever I ran out of my own books, I had no elder brothers or sisters to get books from. So I would delve into my father's and mother's bookshelf. And that meant that I was reading prematurely and perhaps without much comprehension, much above my age level. In the process, I think I acquired both a fondness for words and for ideas that has stood me in good stead. It was only in my early 20s, in fact, that finally inhalers sort of got to be invented and I could use them, and life became much more manageable. And the consciousness of the challenge of breathing was much less a dominant element of my life. But growing up with all of this meant that one, I thought, went through a certain process of being able to stay focused, being able to do things that didn't involve a whole lot of physical activity, because that wasn't physically always possible for me. And at the same time, because you read so widely and eclectically, you developed a fairly wide-ranging intellectual curiosity about life and the world, which has stood me in good stead since.
I think that's something that really comes across even in some of your own writing. that there is a page where you're talking about what's happening with the United Nations, and immediately you're also talking about something in politics, something about human relations, and all of this. Let me sort of switch tracks and ask you about this unusual company you seem to keep in the last 10, 15 years, the Indian politicians. We have a way of speaking about politicians if they're big leaders, right? Whether it's Nehru, Manmohan Singh, Vajpayee, Modi, whoever that is, you speak in terms of their ideas. Nehru means the ideas Nehru stood for, and Vajpayee means ideas Vajpayee stood for. You may like some of these ideas, you may not like some of these ideas, but you at least have a way of talking about these people. But what about those other 400 and 540 odd parliamentarians you hobnob with? Can you give us a sociology of the Indian politician? What is this person doing? What is the aspiration of the typical Indian politician you meet? I'm not talking about you, because I'm still considering you a bit of an insider outsider in that group of 540 odd people. But really, because apart from saying that, okay, here are guys who are near criminals, nepotistic, so on and so forth, we really don't have an insight into the mind of the Indian politician. What really animates
I
them?
think there really is no generalization. There's no one size fits all answer. I think everyone is very, very different. You're right, there are some with criminal charges against them who have come into politics as a way of exercising power that they also exercise through other means and not always licit. There are people who are there because they sort of come from traditional backgrounds of importance and stature in their societies. People look to them to give them leadership. There are other people who come because it really is the family profession. Since that first generation who fought for independence, many of their descendants have continued in politics. There are some who are there because they genuinely care about ideas, and I'm certainly not the only one. There are many, many others who are in politics because they want to influence policy, they want to debate issues and ideas. And there are also people in our country who, as far as I can see, are in politics almost, shall we say, without much thought. I mean, it was something to do. They may have stumbled into it, and I would say that perhaps they don't necessarily bring a whole lot of conviction to it. So all of these kinds exist. The most common denominator of all is that most of them have done pretty much nothing else all their lives. That is, they came into politics often from student days onwards, or they were working with a father who was a politician, or a mother, or an uncle, or whatever was a politician. And they kind of grew in the profession with any or without any of those attributes that we talked about. And as a result, it became for them as much of a profession as teaching is for you, or as management is for someone else, or engineering for someone else. It's just something they do. Now, I believe there are changes happening. I mean, I'm not a sociologist, and I don't claim to be anything more than an observer of what I've seen of other colleagues. But I would say that a lot of interesting people are coming into politics who might yet change its face. There are young people who have joined all parties fresh out of university, and often burning with idealism and interest and a desire to make a difference, who are not from what you have just referred to as the typical politician stock. Many of them could as easily have been comfortable in the offices of a private firm or a business or something else, and they've chosen to go into politics. I think as they grow, they initially come in on the staffs of politicians. They're not the kinds of people who easily get elected. But with their involvement, with their familiarity with the issues, with their assistance to people in the political world, they too might acquire the skills, the connections, the network, and possibly also the ability to become politicians themselves. And I think some of that is happening, and there'll be more of that kind of person coming in. The young man who's traveling with me here, who's actually making some calls outside the room, is an example of someone, foreign educated, sort of affluent middle class kind of, upper middle class kind of background, who suddenly decided that this is a field that he's interested in. And perhaps we'll find more examples like that. Bright young people who could have done something else but have chosen this field. And the other thing is, as the electorate gets more sophisticated, more educated, and more demanding of politicians, it's likely that a different breed of politician will attract their support and win their votes.
So, in that context, you characterize your own career as a politician, and the phrase you use really grabbed me. You say, with some irony, despondency almost, if you were to say, of retail politics, right? Of here are your constituents coming in asking for a job, for a shifaris letter or something else or the other, and they're not really interested in the concerns that animate you about lawmaking, policies, and all of that. Where do you see that going? Because there is also the other concern that you keep talking about in various other fora about, some kind of a democratic backsliding across the world, some kind of a populism that's coming back. It seems like I almost said, do we want to save democracy from the people, or is it something else that's happening here? The contrast clearly that I was talking about when I was reading you was between institutions as the root of democracy versus the people themselves.
Well, look, let me say that that's also a form of democracy. That is that our people, and remember this goes back to the time when the state was very much the Maa Baap Sarkar, and the state was pretty much in control of everything. And indeed, people felt that if they went to a politician who was powerful or influential, that person would make one call to a minister and get their son a job. And perhaps there was a time when the state was like that, and the state commanded the principal sectors of the economy, and it was possible for a politician to deliver. It's difficult for people to grow out of that mentality, and it's certainly hard for them to accept that they've come to a politician for a favor like this, and the politician is unable to deliver. That all I can do is write a letter to a minister recommending someone, but the fellow may or may not get a job. In any case, the kind of job he's qualified for is no longer in the minister's power to give. So all of these things, the expectations of our public will also change, are already changing, I would think. But in many ways, what I see with what's happening in our politics, what I see is that some of these elements are particularly of people who need help, and they think that the only way that they can get that help is by turning to their elected representative and saying, please help me. Because the elected representative is assumed by virtue of his election to have clout over and above the ordinary. So yes, you do get people coming and asking for jobs, including in the private sector, but they principally prefer sarkari jobs. Secondly, you get people asking you to talk to banks to get them loans they were denied, or talk to banks to help defer repayment on loans they took and can't pay back. So personal financial issues of that nature. A very common issue is transfers. Now, particularly since Keralites, and I represent the capital of Kerala, many Keralites have jobs all over the country in government institutions, CISF, BSF, the army, various public sector banks, and so on. And very often they're far away. Their families want them back in Kerala. So pretty much every constituent seems to have an aging mother who's ill and needs attention, or a wife who has a job in Kerala and they should be back with her, or a father who is gravely off, and so on. And the relatives come with letters because it's inappropriate for the actual government employee to ask a politician to intervene, but it's perfectly okay for a relative to do so. So the relative can come and ask, and then you have to write to the minister and try and help them. And obviously the odds of success are not always very high. But you, in turn, as the person who has won their votes and who has to go back to them and ask for votes again, you have a duty and an obligation to actually respond to their request, whether or not you think it's worth doing and whether or not it's something that can easily be done. I remember one story that I heard that boggled my mind was when somebody went to his MLA, who happened at the time to be the chief minister of Kerala, and told him, listen, I'm going to America and I want President Clinton to receive me. Can you write a letter to President Clinton? Now, the chap had absolutely he was just going for tourism. He had absolutely no particular claim on that. Now, you or I might have said to him, listen, this is not how it works. I can't really do this. In any case, before any Indian goes through this, we'll have to go through the embassy. There are all sorts of procedures. You really wanted, the chances of getting it are not really good. Why don't you do something else? Maybe we can ask the embassy to arrange a tour of the White House for you or something like that instead. We might have said something like that because we know how fatuous and crazy the thing is. But my chief minister of that day was a true blue career lifetime politician. And he knew that the prospect of Bill Clinton actually seeing the letter and thinking this chief minister is an idiot was so much less than the prospect of his constituents saying, my MLA turned me away, that he wrote the letter. And he gave it to the guy and said, you sent it to Bill Clinton. So this is the kind of expectation that your voters can have. And honestly, in some ways, the good thing about our democracy is that the elected representative does feel accountable to the voters in this way and every other way. But I didn't pretend that it's intellectually satisfying to be on the receiving end of a whole bunch of these. You do them, it's called constituent servicing, it's a legitimate responsibility of a politician, but it's not necessarily the kind of policy issues that many of us would like to engage with.
Just moving on to the diplomacy side of your personality. There's something I read in your writing where you've been a great champion of the United Nations, but there's a passing remark where you say, if by the next 15 or 20 years, India is not on the Security Council, we should probably be wondering whether the UN is a worthy goal at all or not. What's the stakes here? Why are we bothered in this changing world of multiple powers and pan-national or extra-national players and things like that? What really animates India's?
Well, it's the only global body there is. And I think we have all in India come to believe, rightly so, and for now, for quite some time, for at least a decade, that we are one of the key players in the world. You know, when the United Nations was established, they chose these 5 permanent members on the simple logic that these are the members without whom you can't have a credible world body. And the world body would not succeed if they weren't there permanently. In fact, if you look back on the predecessor organization, the League of Nations, what happened there was that the Americans didn't join, and their absence was a crippling blow from the very start. Then of the other superpowers of the time, the Germans were expelled, the Italians were expelled when they marched into Ethiopia, Abyssinia, and the Russians got expelled when they marched into Finland. So essentially, most of the powers that could actually destroy the peace and security of the world were not in the League of Nations. And they worked in principle by consensus, so if even one person disagreed, nothing could get done. So when they devised the new organization at the end of the Second World War, they wanted a system that would work because all the big powers would stay in it. And since they knew the Americans never joined the League of Nations because the Americans felt that it would be a constraint on their influence, they wanted to ensure that the big powers of the world would actually always be secure. They had a veto, so nobody could do anything fundamentally against their interest. And that's why the victorious powers of World War II were essentially the 5 permanent members. The 5th one, China, one can debate whether they really deserve that slot. But certainly, because, you know, they were themselves under occupation for quite a long period in the war, but certainly the logic was that we do need an Asian power as well, since China speaks for ancient civilization. India was not yet fully independent. In fact, it was not independent in 1945. And so there was a feeling that you're giving the British Empire a seat through Britain, you're giving the French Empire a seat through France, but you were not actually finding any other way of accommodating a power that was not white, to put it bluntly, because the 2 big antagonists of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union, were the other 2. So here you have 5 powers, and they have a veto, so they're secure. And the logic was, if any of them left the organization, we really wouldn't be able to make it work. But of course, what happened was China was then changed. I mean, the government that the world recognized, particularly the Western world recognized, was the government of Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist Chinese leader. But he was overthrown by the communists 3 years after the UN was founded. And when he was overthrown, he fled to a little island called Taiwan. But because he had the recognition, he continued to occupy the seat of China for another 23 years, or his government did, while the big Chinese Communist government was left out. And that's one anomaly. The other big anomaly was the United Nations was actually the alliance of World War II converting itself into a peacetime organization. Because while the media called them the Allies, the World War II allies were actually formally called the United Nations. And when the war was over, they converted themselves into this new peacetime body. And that's why you have these powers. And in fact, in the UN Charter, there's still a reference to enemy states, by which is meant Germany and Japan. Now, today, Japan and Germany are the second and third largest donors of the UN, but they're still referred to in the Charter as enemy states. So these were amongst the anomalies. Now, why does all this matter? I'm sorry I got sidetracked because the subject is one can go on with for a long time, but I'll try not to. Why it matters is that your presence is a recognition of your status. And it also ensures the capacity to have a certain level of involvement in world affairs without others doing anything you don't like. For example, if there ever were to be action taken against India, say on Kashmir or something else the world disapproves of, we would have to require one of the permanent members to veto it for us. When there was a certain amount of hostility to our stand on Kashmir, the Russians protected us. Today, the Russians are no longer the old Russia. They've also become, especially after the Ukraine war, more and more vulnerable, more and more dependent on China. You know, if China is an ally of Pakistan's and they want to censure us on say, Kashmir, and for whatever reason, if the West is not prepared to play our savior, suddenly a big country like India will find that it could be sanctioned or censured in some way by a world body because we don't have the ability to stop it. That's a sobering thought. We feel the time has come for us to be treated on par with powers like Britain and France, which no longer control empires around the world, but still hold on to their seats. So that's basically the short answer. At the end of the day, I would say that even amending the charter is not going to be easy to give us a seat like that, because first of all, people say, why only India? There are other countries that equally deserve it. And secondly, because if you can't even amend the charter to remove an out-of-date phrase like enemy states, where are you going to be able to find the majorities required to amend the charter to create new permanent seats? That remains a real challenge.
Right. So continuing with that thought, let me sort of place a proposal in front of you based on your own writing. You have drawn attention really very intelligently, I thought, to the destability that has come in after the Cold War era, right? It seemed like the Cold War was really a better place to be in because there are these two masters of the world and someone or the other is watching out for things. And then there is the critique of British imperialism that you've been making. I was trying to see if there's something one can say about both of these put together. One of the ways one could diagnose this entire situation is to say that the big powers, in this case, the US, is abdicating its imperial responsibilities. But I'm sure as a UN diplomat, you would abhor that kind of a suggestion. But anyway, now that I've made the suggestion, what do you think about it? What do you think about?
I don't even accept the notion of imperial responsibility. I don't grant to any imperium the right to have responsibility for my welfare and that of my people.
So would that be, if one were to draw you on this, that the responsibilities of the larger states and the responsibilities of the smaller states will all be equal in your ideal United Nations that you're talking about? Okay. And you would want to...
There are responsibilities that states have because of their size. A big country has certain responsibilities with smaller neighbors. And very often it has to live with the resentment of the stronger, of the weaker neighbors, smaller neighbors. I mean, there's a famous line by a Mexican president of the early 20th century, Porfirio Diaz, who said, "My poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." And it's that sort of thing. I mean, the US, not because it is an imperium or has an empire, but because as a big country, its resources, its capacity, its strength means that it is in a position to exercise some influence for good or for ill on others. Today, I mean, the Russians did the same thing during the Cold War period. The Chinese are heading in that direction, and are, the whole Belt and Road Initiative is a way of influencing other countries through their financial surpluses. They have trillions of dollars of foreign currency saved up in reserves, and they want to spend it to expand their influence. So these are the kinds of things we're seeing other countries do. That, I think, we have to accept as inevitable, because the world is an unequal place. But the notion of imperial responsibility, I'm sorry, I don't buy. The British had an empire. That empire is gone, thank God. I know there are some people who, after this Brexit from the European Union, spoke about Empire 2.0. I said to the British, when I was asked about this, Empire 1.0 was such a bad idea. Why do you think there'd be any audience for 2.0? So Britain is a country with all the qualities it has, as is France, and a great history. But it has to exercise its current responsibilities as the state it is, and not as part of any imperial legacy that it chooses to exercise.
I think that's really clearly put. Probably I'll ask.
Ashwin, you may need to move your mic.
Sure.
Closer, yeah.
I'll ask my last question and then open it to the audience, because I'm sure there are some really important questions in the audience. This is about your commitment, conviction to the fact that you're a Hindu. You've written a book about the Hinduness of your upbringing. And you also note that it's a strange thing to do, right? No one would argue for why they are a Hindu, or why they're a Christian, or why they're a Muslim. Probably they would argue why they're not a Hindu, like Kancha Ilaiah wrote about his problems with the religion and things like that. So would you want to reflect a little bit about where that is coming from? And in addition to that, I had this strange idea that your Hinduism was more a genre's Hinduism than the Hinduism that people might be practicing. Would that be, if you take it as some kind of a complaint, would you want to respond to that complaint and see, no, that's not my Hinduism?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, let's face it, many of us, perhaps a large majority in this audience, probably are Hindus who practice one form or the other of the faith that they grew up with, as I did, and didn't think about very much, as also most people don't think very much about things they take for granted. And religion, for most of us, is in our lives. It permeates our society, and we tend to assume it, as it were, rather than think about it. I thought about it because, as you know, as we said at the beginning, I read a lot and I was curious about things. And so I read a lot of books on Hinduism. I was very attracted to Swami Vivekananda and his teachings. And there was a great merit for this Anglophone urban middle-class boy that Vivekananda did almost all his preaching in English. And therefore I had access to his original thoughts, not mediated through translations, which of course our sacred texts have to be understood. If you're not a Sanskritist, and I'm not, you really have to understand them through translations. So I read rather widely, and I must say I was very, very attracted to what I understood of the faith. And I wrote about it very briefly in India from Midnight to the Millennium, which was published now a quarter of a century ago in 1997. And in about 2 or 3 pages, I said more or less what became the core argument of why I'm a Hindu. So I didn't think it was necessary to expand on it at that time. Basically talking about Hinduism's openness, acceptance, eclecticism, and an unlikely vehicle for the kind of fundamentalism we were reading about in the 90s of so-called Hindu fundamentalism. I said this, how can you have Hindu fundamentalism and Hinduism as a religion without fundamentals? And I went on to explain what I meant over a couple of pages. But then when the BJP arose and spread its particular interpretation of Hinduism, of Hindutva, Hinduness, and the political activists behind Hindutva carried that doctrine, if you like, to a certain extreme and began winning votes in the name of their religious faith, the moral urgency of finding and articulating a coherent response to it struck me as necessary. If I am a writer and a quote unquote public intellectual, whatever that is, then I have an obligation to contribute whatever my intellect can to the public by addressing some of the issues that are inherent in this challenge. And so I decided to write it. My publishers were interested. It was, in fact, shortly after my book on colonialism and imperialism, so as different in terms of theme and and texture and concern. I made it fairly personal, as I don't claim to be a I'm so sorry. I don't claim to be a theologian or a great expert on religion. And so I wrote it as the story of a Hindu. So it's why I am a Hindu. So if a Hindu who grew up with Hinduism in India, practices it to this day, has certain beliefs. What are those beliefs? What did I learn from the practices I saw around me? And what did I read and understand from what I read about the faith? And so I described a Hinduism which, in Swami Vivekananda's words, is not just a religion of tolerance, but one of acceptance. He said famously in his speech in Chicago that these very words, he said, I'm proud to speak to you of a faith that has taught the world not just tolerance, but acceptance. And since I read more of what he had to say, it's something that struck me as a profound insight. Because like many of you, I went to school and learned in the history classes that a tolerant king is a good guy, tolerance is a good thing. But when you think about it, as Vivekananda has done, you realize tolerance is basically a rather patronizing idea, right? Because tolerance essentially says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. That's essentially all that tolerance is doing. Whereas acceptance, which is what Vivekananda teaches us Hinduism is about, says, yes, I believe I have the truth. You believe you have the truth. I will respect your truth. Please respect my truth. And to my mind, that is one of the most fundamental assets of Hinduism, this sense of mutuality. And this is why we have been able to live both with the diversity and pluralism within Hinduism, the 33 crore gods we know about, and at the same time, accept that other ways of worship are equally valid. Vivekananda used to quote the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which says that as many rivers go and flow in different directions, some straight, some crooked, in different ways, and find themselves ending up at the same sea, so also all modes of worship will end up at the same divine, the same ultimate being or entity or idea, whatever you want to imagine your divinity as being. And that therefore, why should you criticize the same being that you imagine as God or as Jesus, as Jehovah, as Allah, as Zarathustra, whatever you want to, that's your personal choice, and we have no problem with it. As long as you don't come and bother us, we won't bother you. That's the sort of philosophy, and it's an excellent recipe for not only religions coexisting with each other, but for a multi-religious society like India to live together. And I thought it was dangerous to see a party with so much popularity and support taking us away from a direction of acceptance to one of non-acceptance, and of that kind of tolerance to one of intolerance, or basically reducing people of other faiths to something that we would consider inferior to what we are, and second class in terms of citizenship rights in our country. And that's why I thought it was necessary to do this. I was very gratified that a lot of people, including people who are supporters of the BJP, came to me or wrote to me or said to me that this book had resonated with them, that this is indeed the kind of Hinduism they know and understand, and made them think about it. That's frankly all one can do with one's writing, is to make people think. And if people don't want to think, there's not much you can do through writing or other means anyway.
True. My last question now, of all these different domains you've worked in, which one has been the most satisfying for you? When I read this, there was a joke that came to my mind. A great Kannada writer, P. Lankesh, when his obituary was printed, there was a mistake in the newsprint. So they said, here is an author, politician, film director, journalist, and Lankesh. The and got misplaced. It felt like that. Here is someone who's doing so many things and is Shashi Tharoor. Which of these has been the most satisfying for you, and
Look, first
why?
of all, they're all me. I mean, what you do is a manifestation of who you are to some degree. And for me, I've never defined myself by function or a title or a position, because honestly, titles come and go, positions come and go. And ultimately, all of these things you do are part of your response to the world you see around you. And some of them manifest themselves in one way, some of them manifest themselves in another. But one thing I will admit is that, I'm already a former minister. One day I'll be a former MP, but I hope never to be a former writer. So in that sense, I think that's what gives me, in that sense, the most satisfaction, because when I'm alone with my mind, my thoughts, my computer, I would end up essentially, I think, perhaps at my, I won't say happiest, because writing can sometimes be frustrating and hard work, and you just don't somehow get it right. And you reread what you've written, you think it just isn't right. And you've got to, if it was on paper, you might tear it up and start again, but it's on a computer, so you can erase it and start again. All of those things are there, but even then, the satisfaction of being able to either relate to the word or create it or move it forward, that ultimately is what sustains me.
I think that's a very poignant and a beautiful note to transfer the questions to the audience.
Sure.
Would Jainal want to take over? Sure.
Or Dr. Tharoor could point.
Yes.
No,
please,
I'd
ma'am.
rather he played traffic cop.
Right. Ma'am, why don't you go ahead?
Sir, recently you had put on your Facebook page the magazine which had published your this thing. We saw the handsome Shashi Tharoor on the magazine page. You had put on your Facebook. I just wanted to know, when you were at UN, at that time, image of India in the world, and today, what is the difference between the two? Have we grown stronger when you than before, or what is the status? Because Germany recently, they talked about Kashmir. So in that context, I wanted to ask this question.
Look, it's a difficult one to answer, because there are some ways in which our image has grown better, and there's some ways in which it's grown worse. One thing is clear, that the days of India as the land of the begging bowl and fakirs lying on bed of nails and snake charmers, those days are gone. In fact, already with the turn of the century and the onset of Indian software people and engineers, the migration of doctors and engineers to Western countries and so on, our image has changed completely. I have written once about how I was accosted by an anxious person in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, and all he could say was, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? The assumption is if you're Indian, you must know everything about software and computers, everything else. That's the image now of it. So in one sense, that's changed. I remember, again, when I was still at the UN in America, there was this new television show, which became later a huge hit, the #1 show for 3 or 4 years, called ER, which stood for Emergency Room. It was about a hospital emergency room, and very popular show. But when the first episode, the pilot episode it's called, came out, it got panned by the critics, because they said, whoever has ever heard of an emergency room in America without an Indian doctor in it? So they actually had to write a part for an Indian doctor. And this girl, Gurinda Nagra, who was bended like Beckham's heroine, she got a role that went on for many years as the Indian doctor in ER. So all these are the new image of India. We are a land of doctors and engineers and so on. That's one good thing. The other thing we had at the time of, I would say, the later part of the first decade of the century was this image of this incredibly diverse democracy. I still remember I was traveling for the UN in the Gulf countries when the Congress Party formed the government at the elections of 2004. I was still at the UN, I was not in politics, but I was traveling in the Gulf countries, and at that time, the Gulf ministers and leaders I met on behalf of the UN, they knew I was Indian, they were gushing with admiration for the fact that here you had a country where the elections had been won by a woman politician of Italian origin and Catholic faith, who made way for a Sikh to be sworn in as prime minister by a Muslim president in a country 80% Hindu. And they just couldn't believe this. This is amazing. What an amazing country you are. And all I could say is, listen, no one's trying to impress anybody. This is simply the way we are. This is the real India. Now, that image, unfortunately, has given way to a somewhat different image in recent years, of more open intolerance and bigotry and even Islamophobia in our society. I'm sorry, starting with the episodes in your state, that have certainly contributed to a negative image. If you pick up newspapers in the Western world, some of these things come through. Now, what can I find that's positive? Certainly our economic growth. That's overall very impressive. We are now the third largest economy in the world in purchasing power parity terms and the fifth largest in absolute dollar terms. So that's very impressive. And the world sits up and pays attention. What else? I would say that our influence in world affairs is not yet where it could be, because if it were, the others would be coming begging us to join the Security Council instead of us having to fight to get that seat, which we haven't yet got. So that is that is a work in progress. But overall, I would say that the one big asset of India was our soft power. That is the attraction of our culture, our way of life, our democracy, our policies. And those have both gained and lost. It's gained in things like the adoption of the International Day of Yoga. That's obviously brought an Indian practice to the attention of the world, and it's giving us once a year a reminder of our great heritage. And it's also shrunk because part of our soft power was the sense that this is a wonderful country, everyone wants to be here and live here. But when they read about assaults on people because of their religion and things like that, there is a certain negativism that comes with it. So unfortunately, a very mixed picture.
We have quite a few. Yeah.
So last week there was a report from a parliamentary committee headed by the Home Minister, recommending Hindi to be also one of the languages for higher education in technical and non-technical institutions. But my question is, yes, first of all, there are two questions. Now, is it for one India, is it necessary that we should have one national language? Secondly, if Europe with 20 countries and 20 different languages,
27.
They could have education in their own mother tongue, even at higher education. Why can't India also have a similar system? And what is your take on the national education policy with reference to all this?
Thank you. Well, it's a very, very good question. I personally don't believe that recommendation from the parliamentary committee can or should be adopted. I'll explain why. First of all, Hindi is an Indian language that's got its roots in the soil of India, but it's not the only such language. In fact, many Indian languages, for example, South Indian languages, are much older than Hindi and have a richer history, literature, and roots in the soil. I understand the desire of the majority, and they are a bare majority, to have their language used in ways that will benefit them. But if you're interested in preserving India's unity, this is exactly what you should not be doing. Because if this happens, you will be denying everyone for whom Hindi is not their mother tongue and not their language of instruction an opportunity to succeed and flourish in such an India. And that, to my mind, will divide the country far more than the already divisive policies of religious intolerance that are being promoted by some. Thirdly, every Indian has a right to expect that the government relates to him and government institutions relate to him on a fairly equal basis with every other Indian citizen. No one wants to feel that in any respect, a government treats one set of people in one way and another set of people in a lesser way. Now, if we switch to Hindi for all of these purposes, the committee talked about not only IITs and IIMs and educational institutions, but also high courts, government files, all sorts of things, then this will be wonderful for Singh and Sharma and Shukla who've grown up speaking Hindi in their mother's lap. But where does it leave Subramaniam and Menon and Reddy? Would they not become restive and say, I can't even connect to my own government. I can't understand, I can't exercise my rights, I can't study subjects that matter. I think the answer lies not in ruining the current world-class institutions we have, which are actually giving us an ability to compete with the world on equal terms. Our engineers, as you know, have thrived around the world. Silicon Valley has God knows how many startups where Indians are on the boards and so on, who've learned in IITs. How many of our IIM managers have risen to the tops of companies, world-class Fortune 500 companies as CEOs and so on, which they would not have been able to do if they learned their management in Hindi. It seems to me that rather than spoiling the existing institutions, if the government really wanted to promote Hindi in that way, which will benefit the 47% whose mother tongue it is, and maybe another handful of percent who are willing, because they've learned it as a second language, as many Gujaratis may have done, or some Maharashtrians may have done, then for those people, why don't you create new institutions which will offer instruction in Hindi and see how many would prefer to join that? You know, those whose aspirations are only to work in Hindi and therefore work only in India may well join it and thrive. But those who still have national and international ambitions would certainly want to go to the existing institutions and try and get their qualifications there. As the world gets more and more globalized, you actually need skills that you can take to employment opportunities anywhere. If you study only in Hindi, you can only work in northern India. You're not going to be able to, your company will not even be able to send you to Tamil Nadu because no one will understand what you're saying there, right? If you work in English, everyone is at an equal disadvantage or an equal advantage. It's nobody's mother tongue in a sense, unless you're from one of the northeastern states where that is really what your mother speaks to you at home. But the advantage of English is that everybody can learn it if they want to and if they have the ability and opportunity to, and it connects them without any disability or disadvantage because of their regional background. So if English can be a good second language for everyone, they can do much work. For example, when you're connecting with a German client or a French client, you don't have to learn English German or French, because both of them will know English as a second language. And that kind of thing gives you an advantage when you're dealing with a globalized set of consumers and businesses and customers. So all of these things have to be thought through before such a recommendation is made. If it is actually proceeded with, and it actually receives the assent of all the authorities, I think it is a recipe for political disaster in our country, because I think a number of people would say we don't even accept such a solution, and you will have language riots and violence once again. When there was a brief attempt made in the 60s to impose Hindi, people died in riots in southern India and elsewhere. We don't want to visit those days again. We are, I think, there's a famous expression, let sleeping dogs lie. I would say let sleeping dogmas lie. Let us not create a new dogmatic approach in the excessive zeal of those who still believe in Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. Because if you continue with Hindi and Hindu at the expense of people who don't speak Hindi and are not Hindu, you will end up destroying Hindustan and the idea of India that comes with it.
Dr. Tharoor, you have a special guest here who might have a question.
Sorry, who's that? Oh, this young girl. Hello. How are you?
I'm fine.
Thank you. What's your name?
Roshni.
How old are you, Roshni? हाँ कितने उम्र के हैं आपके कितने साल के हो गए
11
अच्छा पूछिए क्या पूछना चाहती थी
मुझे आपके तरह लेखक बनना है मैं लेखक बन सकती हूँ
समझा नहीं
wants to become an author like you, how can she do that?
देखिए मेरे ख्याल में लिखने के पहले आप पढ़ लीजिए बहुत आप पढ़ती हो किताब पसंद करते हैं सिर्फ स्कूल की किताबें नहीं उसके बाद होमवर्क करने के बाद ही किताब पढ़ती हो हाँ बहुत अच्छी बात है तो जब आप किताब पढ़ेगी ना आपको समझ में आएगा कि किस किस्म की किताबें आपको पसंद है और अगर आपको लगा कि इस किस्म की कहानी मुझे पसंद है तो उसी जैसे आप लिखने की कोशिश कीजिए अगर आपको कविता पसंद है तो आप भी कविता लिखने की कोशिश कीजिए अगर आप इतिहास पसंद करते हैं जो भी आपको पढ़ने में अच्छा लगता है ये लिखने की कोशिश कीजिए और आप पहले अपने आप के लिए लिखिए माँ बाप के लिए लिखिए उनसे पूछिए कि क्या क्या अच्छा था अच्छा लगा उनकी मदद भी ले लीजिए फिर आपको हिम्मत जब आएगी आप दोस्तों को भी दिखाइए और जब दूसरे लोग पढ़ेंगे और कहेंगे कि देखिए रोशनी बहुत अच्छे लिखा आपने और दिखाइए तब तो आपको पता है कि आप लेखक बन सकती है ठीक है करते रहना I can see that. She is a brave girl. बहुत हिम्मत वाली लड़की है.
All right.
और एक दिन शायद आपकी कहानी भी आप लिखेंगे, आपकी आत्मकथा, कि ये कैसे हुआ, क्या हुआ, आपने इस पे इस जो चुनौती है इसको कैसे आपने महसूस किया, और क्या करते हैं आप, क्या कर सके और क्या नहीं कर सके. ये सब भी लोगों को बहुत बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग, बहुत दिलचस्प रहेगा अगर आप लिखे तो. सोच लीजिए. हाँ, गुड लक.
Ashwin, we can take about a couple of questions, 2 more questions.
Yeah, we could get something from the middle there. Yeah.
Sure. Good evening. Yes, unfortunately. No, the emergency was definitely a bad period in our political history, and I've written about it in my earlier books. So, you probably know my views. I thought it was most unfortunate. I was in America for most of it, so I was a student there, but I saw it as a result. The advantage of distance is you can see the wood, even if you can't feel the trees yourself. And I must say that it was in many ways a formative event in our political history, because for a lot of people, their faith in the importance of democracy got strengthened because of the experience of losing that democracy during those 22 months of the emergency. And they said, never again, we must fight to ensure that it never happens again. And since our present Prime Minister was one of those who fought against the emergency, he too has learned that you must never declare an emergency. But I think he seems to have, and his government seems to have found ways of achieving the same sort of control without doing them. Mrs. Indira Gandhi chose for a while to censor the press. Nowadays, you don't censor the press. You telephone the owners, or you send them the IT and the ED, and then the press censors itself. So that's one kind of approach. You don't arrest politicians, but you slap cases against them for all sorts of things under various laws, sometimes with or without bail. And then you don't need to arrest them because they're tied up anyway, defending themselves and going to court all the time and so on. You don't need to ban demonstrations and lock up dissidents. You ignore the ones that you feel you can ignore, and again, you slap cases against or arrest the ones who get too pesky for you. And so it goes. This is why people talk about an undeclared emergency, because all the things that for 22 months in our politics were done very overtly are being done more subtly, but they're still, unfortunately, having a similar chilling effect on our freedom of expression, on our freedom to dissent, on the autonomy of our institutions. And these are things that obviously someone like me would very much worry about, because I'm a member of the opposition, but also because I'm a concerned Indian citizen. And the kinds of things that I find valuable and precious in my country's democracy are, as a result, under daily constant threat without having to declare an emergency.
Right. We have time for one last question.
But we can take
Okay.
a couple. I think till about 7:30 is okay, General. No more. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sir, good evening here. Sir, question to a former diplomat and external affairs minister for state. What is your opinion about India's new assertive diplomacy? And if diplomacy is going to a wrong way, what's your way of correction?
No, when you say assertive diplomacy, if you mean that we speak fairly confidently about our own country, I think that's a good thing. I think that we haven't, frankly, diplomacy has been one area where we haven't been too weak. We've been able to articulate ourselves fairly effectively. But we must also remember that it's less important to win an argument than it is to win friends. So that there has to be a balance struck between our assertiveness and the net substantial benefit to us. On the whole, I would say that India is speaking up for itself with some confidence, and people are listening to us with some respect, which is important. But at the same time, I have to concede that if you look at India's substantive foreign policy in some areas, there are areas for criticism. I, for example, am dismayed that 2 years and a half after the Chinese killed 20 of our soldiers, that they're still parked in an area which we used to patrol, and they have pitched enduring installations, not just temporary tents or whatever, but constructed settlements there, which is very clear they're not going to go. Now, whether it's our territory or their territory is beside the point. The border is still undefined. I agree with that. But there used to be a kind of no-go agreement on both sides. Sometimes we would patrol there, sometimes they would patrol there. But it never became a fighting match between the two sets of soldiers. The Chinese have unilaterally taken a different approach. They have pushed us out. They have killed our soldiers. They've established themselves. And where is our foreign policy on this? What have we done? We're still, not only are we completely in the same relationship with China, our trade with China has gone up 4 times since then. So what at the end of the day is our foreign policy trying to achieve? What are the signals we're sending? That we can be pushed over, that 20 of our soldiers can be killed and we'll do nothing about it? It's a tough question to answer. And I'm not saying that we should go to war, but maybe we could have found some approaches that clearly our government has, for whatever reason, not found the willingness or the spirit to find.
Yeah, can we get one of you there? You have the mic.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Your latest book is about Ambedkar,
Yes.
on Ambedkar. And I wanted to know that caste has been such a strong identity marker in our country. Do you think that it can ever be eradicated, or at least in the political arena? Can you do something about it? Because it's becoming more and more defined. And these identities, which should not have been so very powerful, are again, even after 70 years of our independence, we are still talking about what caste we belong to. So do you think it can ever change?
I wonder, because as you know, Dr. Ambedkar's talked about unhighlighting caste, making it, eradicating it. Nehruji thought that caste was an old-fashioned idea which would simply disappear with time. But our democratic politics has meant that as politicians looked for bases on which to mobilize voter support, caste as a marker of identity became a very important basis. And as a result, political interests became entrenched around ideas of caste. And now, as you know, there are entire parties that have been created in reaction to it. It's very difficult to imagine that notion of caste identity can disappear. It does seem to have become more entrenched, unlike what people of that freedom struggle generation thought. However, what we can try and ensure as much as possible is that the toxic elements of caste discrimination should be gradually removed, where people do not feel that caste comes with opportunities and disabilities, and that people of some castes have to suffer a certain kind of treatment and some castes benefit in certain ways, that kind of thing. If we can get to a point where it means a little more than that of like the old boys network of the school you went to, or the cricket team you support, your loyalties to a particular football team, and that kind of thing, that would be harmless and people would not object. But right now, there is a certain venom associated with caste differentiation, which is sad and difficult. And I would say to you that as far as your question goes, whether we in politics can do anything about it, we're the last people who can do anything about it. Because, you know, I don't know if you know this expression which came from American English, the third rail. In America, in the subway system, there are 2 rails on which the subway runs. And underneath it, there is a third rail which gives you the electricity to make the subway run. And obviously, if you touch the third rail, you die. The electricity you'll get electrocuted. Caste is the third rail of Indian politics. No one is going to touch it and interfere anyway. In fact, every time somebody just wants to renew reservations that came first in the Constitution for SC/STs and subsequently after the Mandal Commission for OBCs, there's almost no debate. It just gets passed unanimously because everyone has no desire to open sort of the Pandora's box in which caste is found. So if at all change has to come, society has to want it. The judiciary seem to have tried. There's a famous decision, not so famous actually, a decision that has been quietly buried in many ways, in 2015 by Justices Gogoi and Nariman, in the Jat reservation case, when they dismissed that and said that they are no longer prepared to accept reservation on the basis of birth, that the government has to come back with a much more complex matrix that takes into account all the decisions, all the disabilities, all the factors that impede and help people: birth, education, salary, whether you're a child of a single parent, what kind of household you have, what your household income is, all sorts of factors into a matrix, including your caste and other disabilities associated with your caste. And then on that basis, create a system on the basis of which you can ask for reservation. That was the Gogoi and Nariman judgment of 2015. If you're curious about it, I think I'm probably the only person who wrote about it. It's on ndtv.com. You can Google my article, you'll see what they said. Amazingly enough, the government never came back with a matrix, and the Supreme Court never returned to that thought again. And subsequent cases have come on reservations, and no one has touched that idea. Mr. Gogoi even rose to be Chief Justice, but we never heard anything about this again. So if the judiciary won't touch it and the politicians won't touch it, society will have to change by itself.
Dr. Tharoor, while on caste, you want to quote what your uncle by marriage very memorably said.
And I don't want to quote it because I'm a politician, so it'll get me into trouble. But as a writer, I had quoted him as making a point once, and it was not in a positive spirit. He said, you can't go forward unless you're a backward. And that sort of thing where, in Tamil Nadu, we've had cases of Brahmins trying to get forged caste certificates showing them to be of a lower caste so they could actually get advantages of reservations and so on. Tamil Nadu, total reservations between state and center goes to the 90-odd%. So these things been happening, and that disability is being turned into an advantage when it comes to career and that sort of thing. And in a sense, people can say, well and good. People who were oppressed or suffered for so long because of their caste are now able under our system to benefit from their caste. So why should you be jealous or resentful of that? So you can have these arguments in every way.
Do we have time for one last question?
Yeah. I think the young lady in the yellow shirt was the earliest one to stand up and raise her hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you
Before
so
you
much.
ask a question, for all those who want a book of Dr. Tharoor to be signed by him, there is a small stall outside. You could quickly buy a book and be back in the auditorium. By the time we do vote of thanks, he'll be ready to sign a few copies for all of you. Yeah, ma'am, please.
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, sir. Firstly, it's kind of very fortunate for me to be able to, for a person like me, to be able to be here and listen to you or even ask this question to you. And I think that I want to use this opportunity to ask you, as a person who holds power at some level, that when you talk about the responsibility of countries, whether big or small, and where does India stand in terms of how we are approaching the current issue, which is, I think, climate, and are we recognizing it as an issue right now, or we don't? And if we are, to what degree are we actually going to be able to, or how long will it take for us as a country to recognize it as an issue, to act on it?
It's a good question, because in fact, the recognition is not so much the problem. It's the actual set of policies and how they're implemented to address the recognition that's the issue. Our Prime Minister has made speeches talking about climate and the need for action. Our declarations in Paris at the Climate Summit have been very good. Our approaches on creating the International Solar Alliance have been applauded around the world. But in practice, how much of our energy is coming from solar energy? How much progress have we made towards the targets we committed ourselves to in Paris in terms of where we should be? Because the target date was 2030. We're nowhere near where we should be by 2022. Then if you look at actual policies, we have very, very good exhortation. Mr. Gadkari is a great evangelist, for example, for electric vehicles and that sort of thing. But where is the infrastructure to charge cars? Somebody was telling me that if there are 2 electric cars in the average apartment building, the entire electrical system in the whole building will blow in trying to charge the 2 cars at the same time. So unless you can actually change all of these things, create charging stations, make all sorts of things possible, unless you can give tax incentives and serious tax incentives for alternative energy and alternative means, why would people change their habits? Not that anyone particularly prefers to have a gas guzzling, petrol or diesel car, because, our prices are going up all the time and it's costing more and more and it's hard. But the fact is that at the moment, it is not financially more attractive for the average car driver to have an electric car. It's as simple as that. You've got to create a mix of incentives, tax benefits, and so on, and the ecosystem to support it. Only then will people switch on a large scale to electric cars. So the ideas, the diagnosis, the recognition, as you put it, is there. The set of policies required to implement effective solutions, I feel, leaves a lot to be desired.
All right. Well, I wish we could take those many questions as well, but he has a flight to catch and we have a few books that he would like to sign as well. So on that note, thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor, for making this evening very special for us.
Thank you all. You're a great audience.
Ashwin
Really
sir
enjoyed.
as well. Just a couple of seconds, I request Mr. Rajiv Gandhi to propose a word of thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, please for a couple of seconds. And of course,
Good evening, everybody. Today's biggest takeaway is that one should do a lot of reading, especially to the youngsters. If they inculcate the habit of reading, it could help them a lot in terms of becoming proficient in a language, as what Dr. Tharoor is, as well as in future could become an author. It is indeed a great pleasure to have Dr. Tharoor at Ahmedabad Management Association. Every time he comes, he mesmerizes the people of Ahmedabad with his profound thoughts, wisdom, and his experiences of life. His books, his work, and his persona is always inspirational and insightful. Thank you is a small word, but nonetheless, please accept our gratitude for gracing the occasion, especially when we are celebrating the 25th year of the Ahmedabad Management Association campus. I would also like to thank today's event moderator, Professor A.P. Ashwin Kumar, and our committee member, Professor Jainil Shah, members and audience of AMA and all office bearers. A special thanks to Crossword for publishing his books, for being the facilitator. Last but not the least, I wish Dr. Tharoor all the best for the upcoming Congress Party elections. Thank you.
all of you, can we just be a little more disciplined, be in a quick queues? It will make everyone's lives much easier. Request everyone, please form one queue and line.